If you own an Epson printer long enough, you will eventually encounter a message that sounds like a terminal diagnosis. A printer's ink pad is at the end of its service life. Please contact Epson support. When this appears, the machine stops working immediately, regardless of its actual physical condition. Inside the machine sits a small foam pad. Its job is to absorb excess ink from the printhead during cleaning cycles. It is a real part, and after thousands of pages, it does eventually saturate. This is where the reality of the hardware and the logic of the software diverge. Epson doesn't actually measure the physical ink in that pad. Instead, the printer relies on a digital counter. Every time a cleaning cycle runs, the number increments. When it hits a preset limit, the software locks the hardware permanently. The pad could be half empty, but because the number said stop, the machine is now effectively a brick. Epson calls this a safety feature, claiming it prevents ink leaks that could damage your home. Yet they sell a digital reset utility that unlocks the printer exactly once. After that, their official policy is to direct you to a service center, where you'll be charged $60 for a fix they've already proven is a matter of clicking a button. The true nature of this lock was exposed by independent engineers who created the Wick Reset utility. It costs $9, takes 20 seconds to run, and does exactly what Epson software does. It resets the counter and brings the dead printer back to life. This means the hardware's death isn't a failure of plastic or foam. It's an event dictated by a software rule. The message isn't a warning, it's a programmed stop designed to force a service fee or a new purchase. To understand why a company would build a death switch into its own product, you have to look at the margins. A standard HP black ink cartridge holds 10 milliliters of ink and retails for $35. That is $3,500 per liter, more expensive than vintage champagne. The actual cost to manufacture that ink is estimated at less than 5 cents per milliliter. This is the razor and blade strategy. The printer is sold at a low price, sometimes at a loss, to get the razor into your home. The profit comes from the blades, the high-margin proprietary ink cartridges you are forced to buy for the life of the machine. For decades, third-party manufacturers have disrupted this monopoly by creating compatible cartridges. They work exactly like the originals, but cost a fraction of the price, allowing consumers to escape the proprietary ecosystem. The manufacturers responded by adding microchips to their cartridges. These chips weren't designed to improve the quality of the print or the efficiency of the ink. Their only function is authentication, verifying that the ink you're using is the ink they can profit from. As third-party companies found ways to clone these chips, the physical monopoly began to crumble. To protect those astronomical profit margins, the manufacturers shifted their strategy from hardware locks to digital ones. In October 2020, HP deployed a remote firmware update to millions of connected printers. There was no announcement and no explanation of what the code was actually changing. The exact moment the update finished, printers that had been functioning perfectly with third-party ink suddenly stopped working. The users didn't get a message saying their ink had been blocked. Instead, the screen read, "Supply problem." By using that specific phrasing, HP made it appear as though the third-party cartridge was defective, shifting the blame away from the software update that had just disabled it. When a class action lawsuit followed, HP argued that they had disclosed these terms. Technically, they had, hidden deep within a software license agreement that is almost never read before a user clicks accept. The case settled in 2024, without HP admitting any wrongdoing. While the lead plaintiffs received a payout, the millions of other owners were simply given the option to roll back the firmware on a few specific models. Epson followed a nearly identical corporate playbook. Court filings show they used firmware updates to disable printers, and then generated error messages that falsely suggested the cartridges were broken or improperly installed. These companies successfully weaponized the internet connections of their devices to rewrite the rules of ownership mid-game, using deceptive alerts to hide the fact that they were the ones breaking the machine. This strategy is well documented in court records. In 2006, Epson settled a class action lawsuit for programming printers to report cartridges as empty while they still contained a substantial amount of usable ink. 10 million people were part of that settlement. In 2017, French advocates filed the first criminal complaint for planned obsolescence against the 4 major printer manufacturers. They alleged that ink pad errors and blocked cartridges were part of a coordinated effort to shorten the lifespan of the hardware. Epson's own 2018 annual report, later used as evidence, explicitly identifies third-party ink as a threat to their revenue. The report made the motive clear. The solution the company chose, however, was to use their software to ensure that third-party threats simply wouldn't work on the hardware their customers already paid for. These aren't technical glitches or safety precautions. They are documented corporate policies designed to maintain control over a product long after it has left the factory. In 2017, the issue reached the United States Supreme Court in the case of Impression Products versus Lexmark. Lexmark argued that their patent rights allowed them to control how their cartridges were used, refilled, and resold. The court disagreed in a unanimous 8-0 ruling. They established that once a product is sold, the manufacturer's patent rights are exhausted. You bought it. It belongs to you. Despite that clear legal precedent, manufacturers have spent the last 7 years engineering their way around the law, using firmware and deceptive messaging to maintain the control the Supreme Court said they don't have. The law says the hardware belongs to you, but the code running inside it continues to prioritize the manufacturer's profit over the owner's rights. In Part 2, we'll look at what is changing right now and what these companies are still getting away with. We've established what is actually happening inside your hardware. Printers are bricked by counters that measure nothing real. Firmware updates are pushed silently to turn functioning machines into locked boxes. And ink is priced at $4,000 a gallon for a liquid that costs pennies to manufacture. In 2017, the legal landscape shifted. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled 8-0 against Lexmark, establishing a hard line on what companies can legally control after a sale. The court invoked the doctrine of patent exhaustion. They explicitly told manufacturers that patent law cannot be used to prevent anyone from refilling and reselling their cartridges. Once a consumer buys the product, the manufacturer's ownership ends. That ruling is binding law. Yet, despite that definitive legal precedent, the physical behavior of these devices remains unchanged. Manufacturers, most notably HP, continue to push silent firmware updates designed with a single purpose: to lock out third-party ink. Regulators have attempted to penalize these practices. Australia and Italy fined HP for its dynamic security features. HP settled a European class action over firmware for $1.35 million. And in the US, they settled a similar 2018 lawsuit for $1.5 million. Following that 2018 settlement, HP reintroduced the exact same firmware locks in 2022 and 2023. The behavior resumed uninterrupted. Legal rulings and regulatory settlements are functionally irrelevant to these operations. For a corporation generating billions from a forced hardware lock-in, $1 million fine is simply a minor operational expense. The industry is driven by a stark mathematical reality. The economic incentive to trap consumers vastly outweighs the regulatory penalty for doing so. On one side, a $1.5 million settlement. On the other, multi-billion-dollar revenue from enforcing a $4,000 per gallon consumable ecosystem. Overlaying the timeline, the 2018 penalty occurs before new firmware updates in 2022 and 2023. The fine just becomes a cost of doing business. This repeated deployment is not the result of a rogue engineering team. It is the correct mathematical move for any entity prioritizing shareholder return on investment over consumer utility. Until the financial penalty for writing a firmware lock actually exceeds the profit extracted from that lock, the technical abuse is mathematically guaranteed to continue. To address the physical hardware currently sitting on your desk, we need to look at specific workarounds. If your Epson printer has suddenly halted with an ink pad end of service life message, your hardware is almost certainly still functional. That specific error is written to mimic a mechanical failure, but it is actually a software counter variable reaching a predefined limit. You can intercept this digital counter directly. A free tool called the Wick Reset utility reads your current waste ink variable and allows you to rewrite it. By typing the word trial into the software, the counter drops to 90%. This instantly resurrects the printer, allowing it to function again. Because this is a physical system, a software reset must be paired with physical maintenance. You have to physically inspect or replace the ink pad, which costs under $15 from suppliers like AliExpress. For HP and Epson users dealing with the secondary defense mechanism, firmware that blocks third-party ink entirely, the required action is preventative. Before connecting a new printer to the internet, you must bury into the advanced settings and disable automatic firmware updates. More technical users can take this further by blocking the manufacturer's update servers entirely at the router level. Consumers are currently forced into an ongoing technical arms race against their own purchased hardware, purely to maintain the basic functional ownership of the device. Globally, the legal system is attempting to formulate a response. In 2017, a criminal complaint was filed in France against Epson, HP, Canon, and Brother under the world's first planned obsolescence law. 7 years later, that investigation is still moving through the French legal system. The complaint against HP was only just refiled and expanded in 2024. The European Union took a broader structural approach, passing the Right to Repair Directive in June 2024. The directive includes explicit, powerful language. It specifically bans manufacturers from using contractual clauses, hardware, or software techniques to prevent the independent repair of goods. North America is building similar momentum. In November 2024, Canada enacted the first national right to repair law, and in the United States, 19 individual states introduced more than 35 related bills in the same year. At the federal level, the U.S. Federal Trade Commission voted unanimously to enforce against anti-repair practices, marking a definitive shift in domestic regulatory focus. This timeline illustrates the core vulnerability of relying on legislation. Code moves instantly. Law moves at the speed of paper. Investigations open in 2017, laws pass in 2024, and member states have until 2026 to enforce them. Structural legislation is undeniably coming, but it moves far too slowly to protect today's consumers from an over-the-air firmware update pushed this afternoon. Which brings us to the ultimate irony of the printing industry. The exact same corporations that have been sued for bricking devices and artificially declaring cartridges empty now manufacture the solution. Epson makes the EcoTank. HP makes the Smart Tank. These are cartridge-free architectures where you pour bottled ink directly into a reservoir. There are no chips, and there is no digital rights management on the ink. To understand why this matters, look at the operating costs. A standard cartridge-based inkjet penalizes the user, costing somewhere between 18 and 40 cents per page for basic black text. After the initial purchase of a cartridge-free printer, the operating cost plummets to under 1 cent per page. This chart plots the cumulative cost of ownership over time. The standard inkjet starts with a cheap hardware purchase, but the aggressive angle of line A reflects the extreme cost of the consumable. The EcoTank, line B, requires more capital up front, but remains nearly flat. For an average household printing roughly 35 pages a month, the math flips at exactly 2 years. At that intersection, the sustainable model mathematically defeats the locked ecosystem. When you scale those variables up to a small business printing 15,000 pages a month, the open reservoir system seeds over $3,600 annually. These machines were not introduced out of sudden corporate benevolence. They exist because consumers ran the math and the collective complaints got loud enough to threaten market share. The EcoTank provides undeniable proof that organized, sustained consumer pushback works. Market pressure can force an industry to abandon a highly lucrative, artificially locked ecosystem if buyers refuse the terms. The consequences of this model extend beyond individual bank accounts. In the United States, more than 375 million ink and toner cartridges are discarded annually. The ecological debt is staggering. 70% of those cartridges go directly into a landfill, where a single toner unit will take between 450 and 1,000 years to decompose. To understand how an entire industry arrives at this kind of systemic waste, we have to look back to 1924, when a group of major light bulb manufacturers formed the Phoebus cartel. At a time when bulbs capable of lasting 2,500 hours already existed, the cartel's explicit, documented purpose was to standardize the failure of incandescent bulbs to exactly 1,000 hours, guaranteeing repeat purchases. They enforced this with fines on members whose products lasted too long. It was the first documented case of engineered obsolescence, and it generated immense profits for decades. The difference between 1924 and today is that modern printer manufacturers do not need to meet in a back room to draft a cartel agreement. They are demonstrating convergent obsolescence. Independent companies naturally arrive at the exact same anti-consumer strategies because the economics of a consumable lock-in are universally irresistible. The mountains of e-waste and the thousands of software-bricked printers are not design accidents. They are the perfectly executed, mathematically intended output of a system where a corporation controls a required consumable. The systemic reality is shifting. The FTC is on record, and global directives are slowly moving into enforcement, but regulatory salvation is still years away. Right now, the most immediate and potent force available to you is informed demand. The illusion of the broken machine has been dismantled. You know how the waste counters work. You know what the background firmware update actually accomplishes. And you know why the supply errors are written to misdirect you. The next time your printer tells you it's dying, check the digital counter first. And when purchasing new hardware, refuse to subsidize DRM-locked consumables. Until the financial penalty for locking a device exceeds the profit of the consumable, the only true fix is refusing to play their game.